we've actually got 4 movies this week because I managed to see one a little early, but of course, as we saw with Brightburn, the few times I get a chance to actually see movies a little earlier than when they come out, it's always the shitty ones. Always. So, start with these. I was initially going to start with Dora, but I think I actually want to start with Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which is based off the Alvin Schwartz books, which I have had forever. And for the longest time now, I have not been able to find them, and it's driving me crazy. But speaking of that, what was really interesting about this movie, and really its existence, was I, like many people, grew up knowing those books pretty much front to back. But the weird thing about it was that almost kind of made it scarier too when I read them. Was that despite the universal acclaim that they have, in my childhood, I never really knew anybody else that knew about them. So there was a long time there when I was first introduced to them that I felt like one of the only people that knew they existed, and I had no idea that it was like a really massive thing until much later. So really just seeing these characters on the screen, especially with the way they pretty much completely recreated them practically, which is something that clearly comes to mind. The first thing that really got this movie hyped for everybody, including me, was seeing Del Toro's name on it. And you can tell by the finished product that it's not necessarily just one of those cases where they pretty much just put the name on the posters and advertisements and all that just to basically get the attention and trick people into thinking they made the movie, just to sort of market it. There is definitely his touch here, even if he's not actually the director. But going into it, story-wise, I was one of the many people, obviously, because you know how much I love my anthology stuff. I was one of the many people going into this saying, oh, why are they doing the Goosebumps thing? Why are they trying to wrap, the story around it and do as much of their own thing as possible when really they could just do an anthology. They can just tell the stories the way they are. I know some people are saying just make it like a Netflix series or something with each episode being an individual story. But the more I thought about it, the more I kind of got away from that because it was like, whether it be movies or TV or whatever, these stories we've known for so long and the imagery in those, the illustrations in them have been in our heads for so long that I feel like pretty much any sort of adaptation in one way or another is going to be underwhelming. So like even just completely and totally adapting them directly, just kind of almost seems futile. So something like this, in the long run, kind of makes a bit more sense, especially when you see what they did with it, which is extremely surprising. How much I really like this. And we're starting with, I guess this year I really love movies set in the late 60s. So this one is 68, and it begins, it's playing Season of the Witch, just so you know the mood. It's got the kids on bikes, so you can do that whole thing. But there's still, like, its own individual atmosphere that it kind of sets up. Like, you can, point to those things and say, oh, it's this particular cliche or that particular cliche to set the time period. But it all just kind of works pretty quickly. Especially with the whole Halloween setting. It kind of gave me vibes of, like, sort of like a theatrical version of Trick or Treat from 2007. So getting vibes from that is a really good start. And then this wraparound story that's happening, because the really interesting thing I liked that this movie did was, I know a lot of people got concerned when it got the PG-13 rating, but the interesting thing about that is it seems to go against a lot what you expect from horror movies for that particular demographic. Because while this movie does feel like it has a really nice flow and it's really great at setting its atmosphere and it does have some, cheap scares here and there to kind of build it up, it moves a lot. It takes a lot longer time to get to where it's going than you would expect in a movie like this with the demographic that it has. Like, the pacing feels like really deliberate for a while there before we actually get to them going to the house and finding the book and all that. So the way they introduce all the characters and their friendships and all that, so everything kind of has the better payoff later. And like I said, in a movie like this, with the way they sort of decided to shape it towards the more PG-13 demographic, that's totally something they could have skipped over. But the fact that they do it in a way that you don't really see that often in this particular movie, aimed at this particular crowd, is really nice and refreshing. Um, and so, as far as the kind of original stuff that they do, that they interject into it, which is actually, you couldn't even say really interject, because it's more of the stories that we do know are kind of interjecting themselves into this story that the creators of this movie have made. But what actually makes that good is that even though it could just be seen as like another haunted house story, like so what, but just the whole thing, the whole build up, and then all of the backstories surrounding that house and the people in it and what exactly happened, does feel in and of itself like a legitimate campfire story, like something that would have belonged in one of those books. Um, which is a really good start, also, especially when you've got the main girl talking about what exactly happened, the way she says the girl that wrote the stories like hung herself with her own hair. Just fucked up shit like that really belongs here and really sets the mood nicely before we even get to the stuff we know. And then there's a whole drive-in scene, like I was talking about before. I love my drive-in settings and the way they set the mood, but the fact that they take advantage of this being set in 1968, so the movie playing is Night of the Living Dead, which in itself is a nice touch, but they kind of went above and beyond with that, with the way they used the movie itself, by using the transition of the scene at the beginning of the movie when she finds the, corpse that's already had its face eaten off at the top of the steps, and it, like, zooms in on it. And I can tell that they use that as an intentional transition and not just like another cut to the movie, because number one, in that moment it takes up the whole screen instead of us just seeing it on the drive-in screen, but also when you see where they are in the movie, it's way after that, so you can tell it was like an actual directorial choice to use that scene for the transition instead of it just being a cut to the screen, which is really nicely done. And then once they go to the house and find the book, then it's the stuff we're familiar with. And the idea of it not necessarily being the stories that we know, but it's like the creatures that we know within the stories that these characters are in now. The whole thing, that it does seem tired to have the whole thing of the story writes itself, the book reads you, shit like that. But this movie handles it so nicely that I'm kind of just okay with it. I'm willing to just kind of go with it, even if it's something we've seen before, because it does it better than the ways we've seen before. So, first off, we're introduced to Harold pretty quickly. We're actually introduced to Harold in the opening, kind of planting that seed in regards to which character he's going to terrorize. And yeah, and as we go to each creature, they not only do they kind of tell the similar stories, which just with the characters we know in this story, but they do find their ways to put their own twists on it also. Like before creature scene is over, it's what we know it is, plus they've done something new with it. Um, which not only is great, especially with some of the freedoms that they take, but it also just kind of falls in line with their stories in general, because when you go back and read those books, a lot of them, probably more than you remember, are like pre-existing urban legends and myths and stuff like that, just that Schwartz kind of put his own spin on. And that's basically what the people that made this movie are doing to them now. And it's kind of incredible how well it translates to the screen. I wasn't quite sure about some of these, and some of the choices that they made. But I'll get to those. Like, the Herald scene in itself is so well done because, really so many things. Like, when he starts moving, that's another one of those cases where you can tell where we have Del Toro's touch. Because it's like, how do you make Harold move without it looking dumb? Or without it looking like, an obvious effect? And with Del Toro's touch, you get those just really weird, sort of indescribable movements, the way that he does. But another great thing about that is the way that they kind of shroud him in the darkness helps that a lot. So, like, really, I say that, and I think the reason I say indescribable is because half the time he is moving, it's only, like, his silhouette from a distance as it's coming towards the character he's coming towards. And I really like the way they did that also. So it's like, we've seen Harold so close up so many times when he's still, but it's when he's actually doing the terrorizing that it's like the camera kind of shies away from him a little bit and really amps it up more, so that when we do kind of get another up-close look at him, it's significantly more jarring than it was the last time. And then it takes this whole other gnarly direction of what happens. Because, of course, we have the image in our head of him laying the skin out on the roof. And it's like, how are you going to be... If you're not going to do that, why even do it? What's going to be scarier than that? And this movie's got some pretty sick and twisted ideas of what Harold is going to do. And I kind of wish I could have seen my own face during this, because it's so unexpected, yet so perfect. How the direction this scene goes, and like so gloriously fucked up. And that's just the first moment. And it tackles a lot of the creatures. I'm not sure how many the trailers let it be known, like how many of the stories are in this. But I'm gonna try to hit all of them in a way to say whether or not they translate well or not. So if there's some that you think you may not know about that you kind of want to be surprised to see, then you may not want to hear the rest of this. But going on also to one of the major scenes in the movie being the toe, which is I think the very first story in the first book, and they seem to have combined two. Now at first I was pretty put off because the whole thing about that story was the fact that we don't see it. It really, really plays up the way he describes the sound and the footsteps getting closer and closer and coming up the steps and being behind the door and all that. That's what makes that story. And that's something that haunted me for a long time after I read that book. That story by itself might be one of the reasons I'm still semi-afraid of the dark. So, but we immediately see the creature. But the interesting thing they've done, and I didn't get a good enough look, but I'm pretty sure the design they used for the creature that's missing his toe that's coming for him is the one that I don't know how to describe it because I can't remember what story it came from. I just remember her fucking face. And that illustration, that was always a page I tried to skip by as fast as possible when I was a kid because that face just haunted me. And I can't remember what the hell story it went with. That's how effective the face is by itself. And I'm pretty sure that's the face they've put on this creature that they've combined with the toe story. I think. I could be wrong, but that's, like I said, the way they sort of show you but kind of don't show you too much, like, at once, really works in its favor. So, yes. And they do have, they have a nice inclusion of the Hearse song, which is really nicely done. And then there is a scene in this movie that is so incredible, and I don't know if it's just because it's so well done and just because it's so terrifying, but it's also the fact that I would have never guessed, of all the stories in all three of those books, this is the one they would squeeze this good of a scene out of. And that's the use of the Pale Lady from, I think the story was The Dream. And if I'm remembering correctly, The Dream is one of the more uneventful stories in all three of those books. Like, it's just, like, very short and to the point, and there's not much to it, if I remember correctly. So it's like, okay, so number one, it's risky enough that you would choose that story, because there's hardly anything to it. But secondly, that picture we saw of the Pale Lady, how do you translate that to screen? How do you even create that as like an effect or a creature in the movie or whatever? And not only that, but once again, the main question is how do you do it without it looking dumb? And this movie always finds a way around that, and somehow they manage to recreate this creature in live action form to where we see it moving and emoting and everything. And it's terrifying. But the way this scene builds up, where you've got the red lights and you've got this constant alarm going off, and the way it just keeps closing in and closing in, is like one of the more effective scenes I've seen in a horror movie for a while. I really think that's going to stick with me for a while. And it wasn't even necessarily the whole terrifying aspect. I kept thinking about how really well executed that scene is. So that's something I never would have thought they would be able to do so well, and work so well with. And like I said, that's where this movie really exceeds in taking the stuff and sort of doing its own thing with it and expanding on it so much. And of course they put the red spot in there, which pretty much goes the direction we would expect it to. They didn't really expand on that enough. But that one's kind of so legendary, once again, kind of an urban legend in itself. They didn't really need to expand on it. It just kind of is its thing. So the one thing that I was concerned about also before I decided to just sort of give into it was I had heard the advertisements talking about the Jangly Man, which, to my understanding, is original to this movie, to an extent. The way he's kind of put together sort of reminded me of the story Aaron Kelly's Bones, I think it was. But it's still obvious, and it's still sort of like putting in just your average horror movie creature into this. But the way they introduce him through another story that we know, and the way that they utilize, well, the thing that worried me at the start when I realized the direction they were going with Meet Take Walker was when I saw the dog in front of the what I guess is a fireplace, which I'm assuming is just sort of materialized in the police station, which is really interesting in itself. But the idea that because that story is another one that like always stuck with me for a really long time, except for the dog talking back. It was always really creepy within the whole dog talking back thing. Was like, what the fuck is this? And it seemed kind of dumb in the moment, but the way the dog talks in this is like so much better than I imagined it in that story. That's one of those things where it's like you just can't even really describe it the way they were able to translate it. And I think that's really the best way you can do it. Is just to not, it's just to be able to say you just kind of have to see the way that it translates, and they somehow made it work. And then the fact that the Jangling Man spawns from that, like he's basically the continuation of that story, and then it's like, okay, I can live with that. That makes perfect sense. And yeah, the way he moves is like really fucked up too. Also, from like you can't quite tell if he's backwards or forwards, and if he's and all that. So all of that just works really well. So yeah, I was extremely impressed with this as a whole. The original stuff and the translations, the adaptation from one to the other. If there's, there will be some things I'm sure that annoy people. Like it does take the approach a lot of the screaming into the camera sort of thing for scares, but those are like really outweighed by the rest of the stuff. Like there was one time where there's a scream into the camera that I wasn't even mad at because of the build up, because it was just like any other jump scare in a horror movie, where it's coming, and so it's like, oh, the character looks this way and there's nothing, the character looks that way and there's nothing, and then oh, the scary face, the screaming into the camera, and then the scene's over. But it felt like they dragged it on forever, which is kind of the best way to do that. When it's like he looks one direction, then he looks another, and then usually about the third time or so, there's the scary thing. But he looks fucking everywhere for the longest time before it finally pays off. And it's like, you would think it would be more annoying, but no, the more they dragged out the silence, the more I kind of appreciated it. So yeah, so I was like really, really into this. I was just talking to a friend about this today, actually, and we weren't even talking about this movie. It's been a pretty decent year for horror, with Us being one of my favorite movies of the year right now, Midsummer being up there, how much I loved Child's Play, and she recommended a few indie ones to me as well. So this could be like a really damn good year. And of course, we haven't even gotten to It yet. We're still a month away from it. So yeah, so this is one of those things that I kind of can't wait to see again. Actually, I feel like this is gonna be one of those horrors I keep coming back to. Like whenever October comes around, this will be something that I revisit like annually. So yes, that makes me really happy that it turned out this well, because obviously, like I said, these stories are something that have been with a lot of us for a really long time, and they could have very easily fucked this up and made it very sort of like Disney Channel bullshit. But yeah, I really love the way this turned out. So yes. Let's go on to Dora and the Lost City of Gold. I wasn't even sure I was gonna, like, see this, at least right away. But I figured, fuck it, I'm sure people would be talking about it, so I might as well do that as well. And just sort of, so nothing's, like, hanging over. Now, unlike what we just talked about, Dora the Explorer is something that I was not really familiar with at all. I want to say it was like right after I got out of watching stuff like that. Like just as soon as I grew out of that whole type of programming is when Dora started. So I like just missed it, but I still knew enough. Like for a reason I can't recall, I knew the characters' names and of course the whole concept of it. So I got the joke immediately of her talking to the camera, and that's about as far as it went. So, but there was still like, yeah, I don't think that's going to impact how I felt about this. I think the movie is going to speak for itself. So it does start off with this amusing joke about I do recall a character called Swiper that's basically the villain that's a fox in like a bandit's mask that just takes shit until they tell him not to. And it starts off with saying, like, you know, this is a true story except for, you know, how foxes are portrayed, because foxes don't swipe, that's a stereotype. And I don't know if it's because it's Benicio del Toro's voice. That probably helps an awful lot. But that little PSA at the beginning was a really nice joke, and then the rest of the movie starts. And so, yeah, I guess obviously they're immediately being self-aware with the whole talking to the camera thing, and Michael Pena says, oh, she'll grow out of that. You know, she's obviously not talking to anybody. And then it cuts ahead 10 years, and she hasn't changed at all. And she reunites with Diego, and they go to school together, and this is Dora basically trying to fit in high school despite being basically nothing more than still the character she was as a child. I can see a winning concept in here somewhere, but there's a lot of things that just really don't ring true. The first thing, really, is the way that they almost play Dora up, like, at the risk of getting into sensitive territory here, almost like she has a mental illness of sorts. And, like, that's basically the whole joke of the movie. But the thing about that also is that it's sort of like it's trying to do a be yourself message, but at the same time, the way that she is like, the movie's constantly trying to squeeze laughs out of that at her expense. So I don't know what exactly it's trying to do, but then when you think about it that much, it's always got that thing, that little excuse that says it's self-aware. So you can never quite tell when it's trying to be something real and when it's trying to be self-aware. And that line never is defined as the whole movie goes on. So it's basically just up to you to guess what the fuck this movie's doing, because it seemed like not only does it not know, but it was too lazy to try to know. It just kind of wanted to do both things, and if one fails, they can use the other as an excuse. And I don't know, like, and there's stuff, like, I'm also not sure about, like, how really fake the CGI is pretty much every time she's around an animal. Like, whether it be, you know, an obviously, you know, animal like Swiper or Boots or something. But then there's a scene at the beginning where she's got, like, a boa around her neck. And it just every animal in this looks totally and completely fake and, like animation. So the question I was asking myself was, is it because it's based on a cartoon? Are they intentionally doing that? I don't know, and I don't care. Because even if that was the idea, that's not a very good idea. What is the... I don't know, what is the benefit from that? So it's like, but once again, they can just fall on the crutch of, hey, we're being self-aware, we're calling it out or something. I don't know. But... yeah, so, and that's also basically, like, the whole being self-aware thing sort of feels like, from a more cynical perspective, a way of cashing in on something, but finding a way to try to not get called out on it. Like, you see something like The Lion King come out, and everybody's saying, like, oh, it's a cash grab, they only did it for money, it's the same thing, or whatever. But if you do that, But if you add a sort of, hey, we know we're doing this thing, suddenly they're immune. And that just leaves a bad taste in your mouth also. But the thing about it also that didn't quite make sense was, I know this is an age-old question for a lot of movies, but this movie in particular really had me asking this, which is, who is this movie made for exactly? Because all the self-aware stuff surely is for the people that probably grew up watching the show, and then now they're like adults or getting there, and this is something that's more like they get that thing, but they also get a more, I don't know if mature is the word I'm looking for, but something to go along with how they've grown. And at the same time, though, there's a lot, like, pretty much all the humor is, like, sort of aimed at children. To the point that there's even an entire scene devoted to her singing a song about shit. Which sounds like, almost, like, this is the kind of stuff that a child thinks would be in an adult version of this movie. You know what I mean? But it still just feels like a child's movie that's trying to aim itself at an older audience, but doesn't want to give either of those things up, and doesn't want to make a fucking decision about what it is or anything about its identity. So they go on and they end up meeting a dude whose name or his name in the movie is like Alejandro, but it is Eugenio Derbez, who we know from like How to Be a Latin Lover and Instructions Not Included and stuff like that. The dude that just kind of recently blew up over here, but has been big for a long time. Who's also like a producer on this or something. He's also in the Overboard remake, and he comes in and he just falls right out of the sky, and he's like, hey guys, come with me, I'm a friend of your parents, and I'm going to help you find them. It's like, trust me, I'm a friend of your parents. You don't know me, we've never met, but I'm a friend of your parents. So this is where you get the idea this movie must be for children, because only children would not realize this dude's a fucking bad guy. But regardless, the movie continues on this until there's a big surprise later. But sorry if I spoiled that for the older people in the audience that have the mentality of a 10-year-old or less. But the other thing that's weird about its identity is it trying to be a full-on comedy, or is it trying to be an adventure movie? Because it's a lot more of one than the other. And as you can probably imagine, it trying to be a comedy is not the way to go. Number one, because it should probably be an adventure movie more than anything else, but secondly because it's not really that funny. Really at all. There's maybe 2 funny things in it. I like the Fox PSA at the beginning, and there's a scene at the end where Michael Pena has an over-the-top crying scene, which I couldn't help but laugh at. Everything in between, that's the very beginning and the very end, everything in between is still trying to be funny constantly. And it's not working. And they were way more focused on that because, as an adventure movie goes, this is pretty boring shit. Not only is it stuff we've pretty much seen before in adventure movies, but basically a watered-down, almost TV movie version of it. This movie has made for Netflix written all over it. How the hell is it in theaters right now? I have no idea. So, yeah, and it was a late 9 o'clock showing. 9 o'clock's not that late, but for a movie like this it is. And there were like 3 other people in there, so I guess that's not really a gauge on how this is going to do, but I felt like the pretty much empty theater I was in was the one that it deserves, the one that it was pretty much destined for, regardless of how well it may actually do in the coming weekend. But yeah, so. And then there's the whole there's a whole big scene of pandering. Where they get high and they become the animation. They become the show, basically. But once again, it's like the 15-year-olds in the audience are like, I'm so grown up now because I'm watching the show that I used to watch as a kid, but now they're high. So there that is. And I'm sure that'll be the scene that people call out. This scene wishes it was the scene in SpongeBob when Plankton goes inside, SpongeBob said, the second SpongeBob movie, when Plankton goes inside SpongeBob's mind and what happens in there. This scene fucking wishes it was that scene. I'll go farther, I'll insult this movie more. This scene wishes it was the sausage scene in The Secret Life of Pets. That's what it wishes it was. It's trying to be surreal while at the same time pandering at the same time, and it's just not working at all. Once again, maybe I had to grow up with the show, but I doubt it. I feel like the movie's just this bad, quite honestly. So, that's, what else do we have here? It's pretty anticlimactic, especially, like I said, as an adventure movie, because not only does it just go from inane set piece to cheap set piece back to inane set piece, but the whole thing's about finding her parents, Michael Pena and Eva Longoria. I said a while back, you can tell the movie's bad by whether or not Eva Longoria's in it. And this has not changed. So when she finds her parents, they pretty much literally stumble across them by accident. That's how much of a fucking adventure movie this is. So, yeah. So that's pretty much what this is. And then it's, has a big old climax, I guess, where they slide down shit. They have to dodge some shit. And it's basically like somebody trying to recreate Raiders of the Lost Ark in their living room. Not even in their backyard, trying to squeeze this shit into their fucking living room. Is basically how this movie looks. So, yeah, no excitement to be found, no particular humor to be found, nothing new to be found, and I will probably totally forget just about everything that happened in this movie by next week, if that. So, there it is. But I mean, if people that like grew up with the show take to this, then maybe I would have missed something. But right now, I don't feel like I missed jack shit, except a couple of hours that I would like back. So let's go on to the Angry Birds movie 2. The movie I managed to see a few days early. It comes out Wednesday, so it's not that early. But I was a little worried about this because I was actually kind of jumped to the first movie's defense when it came out, because it was funnier than I thought it would be, and just sort of all around not as much of a waste of time as I thought it would be. Like, it had an energy that I liked about it, and all that. And I did feel like it kind of ran out of gas pretty quickly because it was so hyper in that first half. But I would still defend it when it came up, and it was like, it's really not that bad, despite what you may think. Well, about a month ago, I saw the first movie again. Like, it was there, and I was like, well, the second one's coming out next month, maybe I should catch up, just in case I need to remember it, something. Just in case I need to remember the cinematic universe of Angry Birds. And unfortunately, I was really kind of put off by it. Like, I actually kind of don't like it anymore. It was a lot more desperate in how hyper it is than I remember. It wasn't as funny as I remembered. There were, like, maybe 2 scenes that I found funny. And, yeah, so that did not bode well at all for this one. But I feel like we're coming full circle because this one isn't terrible. Like, having just revisited the first one and just seeing this one, I like this one better. But now I've learned after the first movie, I don't know how long that's going to last. So let's enjoy it while it lasts. It does start off, and we have the whole thing where they've basically decided to live in the same area as the pigs, but they're still constantly fighting. But then there's another thing that happens that's another enemy that the birds and the pigs have to band together to go against, and it's like an island of ice with eagles, and our main antagonist is a purple one voiced by Leslie Jones with a little sidekick played by Tiffany Haddish. Great. And then it tries to catch us up a little bit with, like, really idiotic exposition. Like, there's actually a moment where somebody says to Jason Sudeikis' bird, hey, you know how, like, nobody liked you until you saved our island? And it's like, when I describe that sounds like it might be intentional on the writer's part, to be a little bit self-aware of exposition, but no, in the context of the movie, it sounds like just that's the dialogue they went with. So that's great, but, talking about dialogue in an Angry Birds movie, what the hell am I doing? So let's go into the whole thing where they go after the eagles, or the eagles go after them, or whatever the hell was happening in this. I'm still not totally sure on some of this, but we do have the returning cast, as well as some of the new cast members. Like I mentioned, Leslie Jones and Tony Hatch and all them. But we do have... The only returning cast member I think we don't have is Sean Penn, which was one of the main sort of, like, gimmicks of that movie, was that it had the whole Sean Penn thing, where we hired Sean... Not only is Sean Penn in the Angry Birds movie, we cast him solely to grunt a few times, and that's it. Yet you can somehow still hear Sean Penn in those grunts, to where enough that you know that it's him. So then this one starts, and it does have, like, when we're introduced to the new characters, there is sort of something there. There is, like, this sort of funny montage of Leslie Jones going through her routine, and just the whole thing that, like, she goes through her daily routine, but everything she does with water is actually ice. Like, it knocks the toothpaste off her toothbrush, she has to take a shower in icicles, and all that. It's funnier than it sounds. So there's that. But then, obviously, there is a plot that they have to stop, etc. Animated movie bullshit happens. So, yeah, it does suffer some of the same stuff that the first movie does, like, the whole frantic nature of it. And the fact that, the whole frantic nature basically has the opposite of the intended effect. Where the more frantic it is, the more it tries to move around constantly. Just kind of the more bored with it you get. Every now and then it pays off. There's a funny moment where, I think Chuck is the Josh Gad bird, the yellow one, where he's, like, bouncing around everywhere and he's trying to explain something. And then at one point, he just happens to pop out of Bomb's mouth. Bomb being the big black bird with the fuse on its head, voiced by Danny McBride. So, like, stuff like that, just unexplained shit like that, kind of works for me and kind of gives the movie a certain bit of, like, its own humor, because animated movies like this that are made for a certain audience obviously have, like, one brand of humor, and it's the same kind of jokes and the same kind of stuff we can identify. But every now and then with stuff like that, where it kind of has, like, its own identifiable jokes, it has, like, its own identity in comedy, at least a little bit, then there's something there. And if we had more of that, which we probably could get out of this cast, it's obviously a sort of writing problem, maybe even a studio problem, but, yeah, there is that, but it's also one of those movies that feels the need to do, like the jokes multiple times over. Like, there is, one particular one where they do the whole thing where, like, characters are, like, it's the characters and what they do in the story, like, you know, Jason Sudeikis is the hero, so it comes up and says the hero. There's a moment where Peter Dinklage's eagle is, like, running away, but it says fearless leader, but the words are, like, physically there. And it's the Lego Movie joke. We've seen that. And then it's stuff like, one of the things that makes me laugh so hard in the first movie, to the point that I always watch it repeatedly when it goes by, is when Bomb goes in, he's explaining what he does and why he explodes in the meeting in the first movie. And he walks into a surprise party, and we just hear it happen in the house, and then the house explodes. And I cannot get enough of that joke. It is still hilarious to me. So, this movie has that joke, but they do it over and over and over and over again in quick succession. And by then, it's not near as funny as it was in the first movie the first time, let alone all the other times it does it. And then weirdly ends, of all places, in a Great Escape reference, where he ends up being put in solitary and hitting a ball against the wall like Steve McQueen. Alright, good luck with that one, kids. So, and then there is another joke that kind of goes against this, though. The whole repetition thing and how we get tired of it, and it shows that the movie just doesn't have the material. And it's, like, really, really trying too hard with stuff that's just not even there. But then, on the opposite side of that, we do have, when they introduce Sterling K. Brown's pig character, which at first sight, when you know it's Sterling K. Brown, is hilarious. And then he has an alarm for them that lets them know when there's eagles around. And this scene, this joke, goes on and on and on and on, where it's the alarm going off again and again and again and again and again. And then after a while he explains to them that this will happen for another hour. So, and the thing about that joke, how it kind of reversed the way this movie... It does what this movie's been trying to do with all of its jokes this whole time, which is they repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and somehow miraculously it gets funnier as it goes. It's that old thing where it's that old formula where it's like it's funny, then it's funny again, then it's kind of funny, then it's not funny, then it's hilarious, and it's, so it manages to find that for this joke, so that works. And then there's a whole thing where Peter Dinklage has like a '90s flashback with basically all the Captain Marvel jokes. There's a blockbuster joke in there, flockbuster, and all that shit. But still just kind of inherently funny in itself. But maybe that's just because I still love the casting choice of Peter Dinklage as this giant eagle that has like this whole sort of heroic backstory to himself, and now he's just like a fucking deadbeat that's out of shape. So, yeah. And then there's jokes where they do something good and then they find a way to ruin it. There's one good joke that they ruined twice, really far apart. They ruined the same joke. Which is there's a whole subplot going on where there's three like hatchlings and they lose these eggs they're supposed to be guarding, and these eggs manage to find their way on top of a snake that's like napping, and so they decide, well, I guess we're gonna have to attack the snake, and so we hear that, and then they come back out and they're like wearing the snake. They've got like snakeskin hats, snakeskin boots, and all that. And just when you have enough time to go, holy shit, one of the halflings says, well, that got dark. And it's like, wow, you had a nice joke. Thank you for telling us what it was and fucking it up. And then they ruined the joke twice by having the snake come back in like a sling and on a crutch at the very end of the movie. And it's like, okay. And yeah, I get it, you know, snakes can like shed their skin and shit, but I mean, that's not really the way this works. So yeah, they had one good joke and they just like actively tried to fuck it up as much as they could. So that's a bummer. R.I.P. Snake a joke. You were good while you lasted. And then there is one scene that I absolutely love, but then I had a rude awakening about it later. There is a scene in this movie that is fantastic and hilarious. Absolutely fucking hilarious. And it is this scene when they all have to dress up in a bird suit and get a key card off this other bird in a bathroom while he's going. They have to get into the urinal next to him, and hilarity ensues for like a good 3 minutes. And I was like, that's a great scene. That is hilarious, and I love that they somehow managed to put it in this movie in just the right way to where they didn't overdo it, but yet it escalates and just keeps going, and it's always funny until it's over. And unfortunately, I saw this before I saw Dora. So, after I watched Angry Birds and I praised that scene and all that, I see Dora. And one of Dora's trailers is for this movie. And that is when I learn that the entirety of the Angry Birds movie 2 its trailer is that scene in its full entirety. They didn't save anything for the movie. This is why I don't fucking watch trailers anymore. And I'm so glad, because that is easily far and away the funniest scene in the movie. And the entire thing is that movie's trailer. Like, they didn't cut anything out of it. Everything you see of the bathroom scene in that trailer is the scene itself in the movie. So that's gotta suck for people who have seen that trailer, then go into this movie having already seen the funniest scene out of context. God, that's gotta suck. So, but as I was pointing out, there's still, you know, some decent jokes in there. Most of them are forced. Most of them are for the demographic. There's not really a balancing out here, and it's like, hey, adults and children can both think this is great. It's mainly at children with a couple of scenes in there. But once again, even the jokes they try to do are usually ruined. So there is that. And the energy in this one is fine. It's not as annoying or forced as it was in the first movie. So it's got that going for it. But I still think it doesn't have quite enough in it to make it be, like, sort of above just a movie you put on for your children to have in the background. Like it's something where if you see it on, it's not necessarily going to be worth watching, except for maybe a couple of scenes. So honestly, so based on that, it's probably exactly, if not ever so slightly better than what most people probably think it's going to be. But a lot of people think the first movie is the Antichrist, so they might be expecting the worst, and it's not the worst. The worst is out there. The worst is out there this year, even. But this is just kind of is what it is. It's pretty much what you're expecting it to be. So I don't know how else you can go on from that. So yeah, and we'll end on The Kitchen, which is Melissa McCarthy returning to drama, Tiffany Haddish trying drama, and Elizabeth Moss just being comfortable, I guess. They're trying to do like a throwback thing here, obviously, with the classic Warner Brothers and New Line logos. And this whole, set in the 70s thing, and it's, to an extent, they do kind of accomplish that. But the thing about this movie is I saw like its Rotten Tomatoes score, which was kind of surprising, because it was really when I looked at it, it was like 20%. And I was wondering what maybe the problem was. And because the story seems somewhat promising. The story is obviously very reminiscent of like Widows from last year, but it's also based on a graphic novel that I've never heard of. So the whole graphic novel nature combined with them really going for the whole setting it in the era thing, I feel like there is something here, and the main criticism I saw in like the summary of the critical consensus was that it wasn't like the actresses or anything like that, but it was like a story problem. But I don't even think there's a story problem. I think this movie is just really poorly made when you look at it as a whole. Because like I said, they've got a nice setup, and they seem to have a tone that they really want to go for, and they have an idea. And they're gonna go for like the more like sort of brutal approach to it. Like a lot of the deaths are like really loud and sudden. There's one particular really gruesome incident somewhere in the middle during like a murder montage. Yeah, the movie does actually have a lot going against it. Just mainly in how it's made, and that's where it kind of falls short. Because as far as the cast goes, obviously, Melissa McCarthy has been growing on me. She was somebody I criticized a lot in the past, but she seems to be... well, never mind, Life of the Party wasn't that long ago. But for the most part, she's finding better projects for herself and utilizing herself better. Tiffany Haddish, I've obviously given similar criticisms to, but I can't say I wasn't curious to see how she'd do with drama, and I feel like there is something here, but her role is just so kind of... Because the thing about Haddish's character is we've got the three women here, and taking her for the business once all their husbands are locked away by Common. But the thing here is that you can kind of tell that McCarthy's going to kind of be the self-appointed leader. Elizabeth Moss is going to kind of be, I guess, the loose cannon, because she's the one that's like... Her marriage is the one that's like the most controlling over her, so we can tell that once she gets the chance to break away from this, she's going to do it full force, and maybe in not the best direction, because as soon as the husbands are locked away in court when they get their sentence, we get a shot of the three women, and they're saying, like, whatever you do, just don't react. Margaret Martindale's there to basically tell them how to handle this, who's basically like the leader at this point. And so Haddish is just kind of neutral, McCarthy is worried, and then Moss has like this smile on her face. And we've known from many of her past roles that Elizabeth Moss has a talent for making her smile very creepy, to basically show that she may internally be an insane person. But you'll notice that, how I said they all kind of emoted and they all have their thing, but Haddish is just there and neutral. I don't think they knew what the hell they wanted to do with Haddish's character, because, like, halfway through the movie, for seemingly no reason, she's suddenly, like, she's antagonistic towards pretty much everything. And then that's kind of the direction we go a little bit, but it's trying to go in a bunch of different directions at the same time. And so that is just one thing that makes it feel really sloppy. And I think didn't give Haddish a fair shot at a role like this. So we'll still hold out and see what else. If she finds something else like this, they can maybe help her out. But for the most part, it is one of those cases where it's basically the movie's really trying to put forth the hardcore setting it's trying to do here. Like I said, the violence is kind of in your face and loud. Um, the characters are kind of trying to out vulgar each other when they're having a they're having kind of a back and forth with Margot Martindale, or from a distance, really. And if you'll excuse me, the scene opens with Melissa McCarthy saying, like, God, my mother-in-law's a cunt. And then when Margot Martindale walks by them, she says, twats. And it's like, you can just tell it's maybe trying a little too hard to do that sort of thing between these characters, but... and because I feel like with these actresses, there is something that could have been a lot more natural in that regard, because it's also just kind of the whole thing about the women empowerment and the we don't need men thing that it goes into, and I'm honestly all for that. Like, I'm not insecure enough to be offended by that or anything, but the trouble with that in this movie is that they keep saying it, which pretty much softens the impact of the whole idea of, oh, it's a story about women who try to go their own way and, shit goes south or whatever. So yeah, they could have probably toned that down as far as, like, dialogue blatantly stating it. And they probably would have had more going in that direction also. But a lot of the movie, and I kind of thought it was just going to be like the first half hour or so, a really disjointed nature to it, where it's like they introduce things really abruptly, scenes like end really abruptly. There's a lot of stuff that's like the order feels like it's not quite there, like it'll cut to something else and you're wondering why they would show this at this particular time just to cut back to something they were pretty much already on, and it just feels really I don't know, just out of whack in general. And I was kind of like, okay, once it finds its footing, I'm sure we'll get past this. But no, the whole movie kind of feels like that, where things are like way too abrupt and way too anticlimactic, especially when the shit really starts hitting the fan and the body count starts to rise, and the body count starts becoming more major characters. It is, like, shockingly anticlimactic when these things start happening. And not in an effective way. Because you can do anticlimactic in a really effective way. Just ask Billy Costigan of just one character. But it just feels so sloppy and like it's in some big hurry. Well, at the same time, the pacing really isn't there, so it seems like it's in a big damn hurry, but it doesn't feel like it when you're watching it, and that's a dangerous combination. And then they introduce the Donald Gleason character, who is like a mob assassin or something. Just really this brutal killer that ends up finding love with Elizabeth Moss's character, which is something that happens about as abruptly as me having said it just now. Like, that's about as fast as it happens. He's introduced just sort of out of nowhere, and then we're told like 2 scenes later, oh, by the way, because he seems to be, in the moment, the first time we see him, just a stranger that intervened in a moment. But then, like, 2 scenes later, we learn, oh, they know him, and they've known him for quite some time, actually. They're actually pretty well acquainted. And it's like, oh, well, I just didn't get that vibe at all at the start, but alright. And that's also to go on the sort of weird contrast between the scenes abruptly ending and it seeming like it's cutting itself off all the time, is there are 2 particular scenes with Donald Gleason in the midst of these where the scenes go on too long, and I was wondering when the hell they were gonna say cut. And so it's like they could never find that balance. They're either cutting themselves off way too soon and feels like there's still more to the scene we're just gonna ignore, or there's like, dudes, fucking end this scene already. So yeah, and then and yeah, just like I said, the whole story with him and Moss just feels so sudden when it gets to the point that it does. there's payoffs later that you just don't feel because it didn't give itself time to do any of that whatsoever. And then there's stuff like there's a whole thing at the beginning to also show how Elizabeth Moss is like walked all over before she goes fucking nuts. Is she works at like this shelter, and there's this homeless dude that gets turned away because he's high, and they won't give you food if you're high, which makes sense to me. But she goes out and she gives him some food anyway. And then when she comes back, he's like in one of the offices and he attacks her. But the way he attacks her is he lunges at the camera and it cuts to the three women walking out of the hospital. And they mention something about stitches, except for the fact that Elizabeth Moss has no visible damage on herself at all. Stuff like that just makes the movie feel so like I said, like the scenes aren't even in the right order or something, or there's a whole lot of stuff we miss or something. And so that's yeah. And then like I said, as it goes on, it simultaneously sometimes gets less interesting and more interesting. There's way too many characters. There's characters to the point that we've got recognizable faces here, like the three of them, and James Badgedale is Tiffany Haddish's husband. We've got Bill Camp as like our sort of head mobster guy or whatever. There's Common that I mentioned. But apart from the people we recognize, the rest of the cast, like the major supporting roles outside of those, it's like they just found a bunch of discount actors. And you know, props to those actors for finding work, sure, but it just sort of felt like you could see the budget running out as they went, as each new character was introduced, and you're like, I don't know who the fuck that is, but alright. So just stuff like that. Every other aspect of this movie makes it feel like it was either really shoddily put together, or they were just running out of things to put into it. And then we get ultimately to a very unsatisfying climax. Climax is a really generous word too. So yeah, so that's yeah. There's really not much else to go on with this. There's also a twist towards the end where they just kind of say like it's kind of a big deal, but they pretty much just say, oh, by the way, this. And then and once again, all that does is lead us to the really anticlimactic conclusion. So yeah, this kind of just felt like a waste of time. There's a little things in there where you can see the quality this probably could have been, where this probably could have been something like really suspenseful and like a really nice sort of 70s period piece sort of thing. But it's just shoddily put together. That's the main problem. And you'd be surprised how much damage that can do to a story that's got something going for it, but it's like way overshadowed by just how poorly it's put together. So yeah, that's really all I can say about it. One final note though being, I really love the Chain, the Fleetwood Mac song, and I know it's a cover here and everything, but I really think movies can give that song a fucking break at this point. James Gunn, look what you've done. So, yes, so that's kind of, I guess I can't say a letdown because I didn't really have any expectations, but it is a letdown in the sense of when you get the sense of what the story is and where it could go. It just keeps fucking itself over and doesn't seem to give a shit about itself. So yeah, that's kind of a bummer. So I think that's going to be it for this week. Next week, I don't know what's going on. We're supposedly getting the Linklater movie, but I'll believe that when I see it. And then I don't know if Good Boys is something I'll wait for down the road or whatever, but I may end up doing another sort of cluster video. I don't know. We'll just see what happens. And I've got somewhat intimidating verses I think I'm going to do. So I will look into that. And then we'll see what happens from there. We're getting closer and closer to Oscar videos. So that'll be fun and something to look forward to. So until all that other stuff, I think we're done here.